Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the It Depends podcast. I, as always, am your host. My name is Kevin Goldsmith. I'm a chief technology officer. I've been a leader, a developer, working in the industry for over 30 years now. And I wrote a book. The book is called It Depends, Writing on Technology Leadership 2012 to 2022. And in this podcast, we serialize the audiobook. So every episode, you get a new chapter from the book. And this week, that chapter is section 3 of a 4-part series on writing performance reviews. This one is about making salary recommendations. And I'm actually really excited to talk about this one. I think it's a good chapter, but also it's just something I've thought a lot about. I was happy to meet some listeners/readers at the Business of Software conference this week in Raleigh. This is my first time attending that conference. It was one that had been recommended to me a long time ago, and I'd always been meaning to go, but finally was able to go this year. Really enjoyed it. For those of you who haven't heard of it, it's a small conference, a relatively small conference, but that is often a good thing in that it gives you a chance to meet a lot of people. And it's a very kind of mellow vibe, kind of mellow environment. While it's called the Business of Software, this is not a technology leadership conference like the one I spoke at earlier this month, Leading Eng. This is for primarily, I would say, entrepreneurs, but it covers not just engineering leadership or engineering, but also marketing, sales, finance, all those aspects of running a business, but primarily aimed at software companies. And I would say also primarily aimed at smaller software companies. So for me, coming from a bit of a larger company, there was some stuff that was helpful or interesting, but maybe not specifically for me. But one of the things I talk about a lot at my level, at the CTO level, is that it's not just a technology job. You have to be a peer to finance and marketing and if you're in a B2B company, sales and product. And so one of the things I'm always advising people who are VPs or CTOs or want to be someday is to actually spend time learning a little bit about this, because what I've seen work for CTOs, work well for them, is to be a good peer to the cross-functional teams, to be interested, to be able to contribute to conversations. What I've seen be a failure mode for CTOs is they're not. I just run technology. That's all I want to talk about. That's all I understand. And they're not a great peer in the exec team. And the CTOs who end up reporting to somebody else in the exec team, that's usually what's happened, is they just haven't been a full-fledged member of that team. And people start to wonder, like, this person isn't really contributing. Why are they here in this meeting? And that's how you end up seeing CTOs kind of nestled under somebody else in the exec team, even in a technology company. In any case, it was really good to spend a few days, met a lot of great folks, and also learned a lot, got some new perspectives on some of these different aspects of the business, which was always helpful. So especially if you're an early stage company or you want to learn more about sales, about marketing, about those aspects of running a software company, I will recommend that conference, and I recommend it without any kind of remuneration of any kind. It was my first time going. It was a good conference. Before I get into talking about the chapter, I also want to share something else, which was interesting. It's not the first time it happened, but it happened twice this week. We are hiring. I work at DistroKid. I'm the CTO of DistroKid. I don't often talk about my company here because it's not a podcast necessarily about DistroKid. It's a podcast about being a CTO. It's a podcast about being a technology leader. And also because I know people from DistroKid listen to it, and I don't want to talk about stuff going on. I've worked at a company where the CEO was an active blogger blogging about the company, and we would find out stuff about the company from the CEO's blog, which felt really weird. So I actually try and avoid talking about my day-to-day. However, we're hiring, and I'm on multiple interview loops. And twice this week, I talked to a candidate who actually either read the newsletter or listens to this podcast or even read my book. And to me, obviously, it's a little bit weird, not in a bad way, in a good way. It's a little humbling because you start thinking about it's still a little funny to me to meet people who I haven't met who do listen and read. I appreciate all of you. But it also struck me it's a really smart thing to do because if you are applying for a job, and I'm not saying you should listen, you should tell everyone you know to listen to this podcast, to read the newsletter, please buy the book. But if you're going to interview at a company, do your research on the company. Go read the blogs coming out of the department. If you're in engineering and they have an engineering blog, go read the engineering blog. If the CTO has a blog, or even if it's not about the specifics of the company, go read it. It helps you understand the folks. Look for the people you know at the company, maybe even second order through LinkedIn. Get introductions to them and just ask them about the company, like what's going on, what are they interested in, what are cool things happening there, and tell them, yeah, I'm interviewing and I'd like to be prepared. It's not going to automatically get you the job, but it's absolutely going to help you. One, it's going to help you prepare for the interviews. You're going to anticipate questions better if you know that they have a microservice architecture, or if you know, because they've blogged about it, like they've been trying to transition off a monolith and here's the ways they've approached it. You're probably going to get some questions in the interviews about transitioning from a monolith to some other architecture, or if they switching from AWS to GCP and they're talking about some of the things they learned there, you're probably going to get questions about that. And they may not be direct questions, they may be indirect questions, but that's what's on the minds of the people that work there. So you come into the interview a little bit better prepared when you're asking questions at the beginning or the end of the interview. Hey, do you have any questions for me? You can ask them intelligent questions about their business because you know a little bit about it. That really will strike the people that you're talking to as this person is interested in the company and has done their homework. And that will always get you some bonus points. So I definitely recommend this. It has been very helpful to me. The worst interview I ever didn't do that. And it was for a job I was pretty interested in. And I don't remember what was going on, like why I didn't do that. I think the whole thing came together really quickly. Or I was being arrogant and thought I knew the product way better than I did. And I talked to, this was like the manager screen essentially, but obviously it was recent, so it was a pretty senior role. And I was talking to this person and they were just trying to talk to me about my experience, really that first screen. And I was just, they started asking me questions about their product. And I didn't have answers for them. I thought I knew their product, but I hadn't really used it. And so then at a certain point, that devolved into like, it was clear. It was clear to me I was doing horrible. It was clear to them I was doing horrible. And I just, somewhere in there, I realized, this is done. Like this will be the last call. And I didn't try and save it. I knew it was over, but I just tried to turn it into a pleasant conversation. I'm like, wait, it's clear that I wasn't prepared, but I'd like to end this positively so that you don't think I'm an idiot forever. And so we devolved a little bit into just a pleasant conversation because I think it was clear to both of us I wasn't getting the job. But one of the things the person said before they hung up was, hey, maybe next time, maybe you should actually try and use the product a little bit so that when I talk to you about it, you're familiar with it. And I'm like, yep, absolutely. You're absolutely right. That was my mistake, which it was because it was a commercially available product. I haven't made that mistake since. That was a few years ago. I've never made that mistake since. That would be another thing I would also recommend to you if you can. I mean, it depends what kind of product, what company you're applying to. If it is a product you can actually purchase or download and try, you should do that. And you should come in opinionated about it because they may ask you. I will if I find out that you are familiar with the product at some level, the first thing I'm going to ask you, or one of the things I'm going to ask you is, what do you like about it? What do you not like about it? What should we do differently? Not because I'm expecting you to have a advanced understanding of our product, but I am hoping that you have opinion, that you've used it, you've thought about it. There's stuff you like, there's stuff you don't, and that you've developed some opinions. And I want to hear about the things that you see as a customer or as somebody who's at least tried it, the things you would want to change. This is something that if I know it, that's something I'm going to look to. So before we start in on the chapter, just a reminder, if you want more information about the book again is called It Depends, Writing on Technology Leadership 2012 to 2022. You can go to the website, itdependsbook.net, and that's got links to all the stores that have it. You could go into your local bookstore and buy a copy. They can do that for you. There's obviously the audiobook because we're about to hear a chapter from it. There's hardcover, softcover. It is available worldwide. So if this podcast has been helpful, if the newsletter is helpful, please do that. You can also find the link to sign up for the newsletter there, and the most recent issue of the newsletter, the most recent podcasts are always there as well. On the newsletter, just something to understand, if you're new, this podcast comes out every other week. On the weeks this podcast doesn't come out, the newsletter comes out. This podcast is going through the audiobook in order. The newsletter is going out of order. So if you subscribe to both, you won't get the same content every week. Now that we're over halfway through the book, we've already done this chapter in the newsletter, which means you can go back and find the text of it. If you like it and you want to have something to share with folk, just up to you. Now, about this chapter, as I said, this is section 3 of writing performance reviews. This one is specifically on making raise recommendations. The content of this chapter actually came from a talk that I gave at Lead Dev Berlin in 2019. So this was published, the first time this was published was 2021, but this actually comes from a 2019 talk I gave. And I think you can find recordings of it. If I can find it, I'll put it in the show notes to see the original talk this came from. And in that talk, I go through the entire process of this is how a budget is created in a company. I talk about some of the tricks I talk about in the chapter around hitting your budget as a manager, making raise recommendations. So it covers a lot of this same material. But I really enjoyed writing that chapter, giving that talk, because, and I avoided it. I wanted to do it for a long time, but I avoided it because it's almost a little bit of a third rail. Like salary's a weird kind of topic to talk about. It's a topic a lot of companies are very hush-hush on. It's a topic that obviously employees are really aware of and think a lot about. So it's a bit of a tough one to talk about. But I just seen so many managers just don't understand how it works. Like they think there's an infinite pot of money for salaries that they can tap at any time and for any amount. And that's just frankly not how it works. That's why I actually start with the budget process, because that is where the money for salaries comes from, is from your company's yearly salary process. I don't go into that budgeting process in this chapter because it's really focused on making the raise recommendations as part of a performance review. But if you're interested in that, it's worth watching that talk because I do cover it, because it is an important part of understanding just how salary works. There's a fixed amount of money set aside for salaries as part of the budgeting process. That money is allocated to everyone in the company, and it gets allocated across the year. It's the increases are set, they're fixed as a percentage of the budget, which means oftentimes your HR team will communicate what that raise budget is. If you go over that amount, you're taking money from somewhere else because that's the pool you're drawing from. If you go under it, that's fine, but that's going to go to somebody else. It's not like it'll be available to you later. Well, I went under on my salary budget, so now 6 months later, I would like to bump up this person. It's like, no, that money's spent because another team spent it probably. I've never seen it in any company I've been in at every level where I've been involved in this. I've never seen it work out. Maybe that's not true, but generally, I haven't seen it work out where at the end of this whole budgeting process for the company, you're not exactly hitting that pool. Because some teams go over, some teams go under. Generally, for me as the head of the technology organization, I'm always going to come in at budget. Because if your team comes under, if I think you were maybe not giving people enough, I'll actually inflate your numbers. I'll give more to the people on your team if you came under. But overall, I'm going to work it out so I come in at budget. And if that means I can give a little bit of extra to some folks who maybe wouldn't have gotten it otherwise, I absolutely do that. If I think some folks maybe got more than they needed to, I'll pull that back and maybe give it to somebody else. But I'm almost always going to come in right at budget because I'm managing a large team. And so I should. One thing I don't address directly in the chapter is if you're a manager in my organization, you're managing 6 people or something, having you exactly hit budget is silly because it doesn't make sense. These are humans we're talking about. Some are great. Maybe your whole team's great. Should your team hit budget exactly? I don't force small teams to budget because it doesn't make sense. However, in aggregate, once you get above 25 people, 30 people, yeah, all right, that distribution should kind of work out just because that's the way that's the way numbers work out. That's the way statistics works out. One of the things I wanted to touch on just briefly in the podcast, because I kind of skate over it, I acknowledge it, but then skate over it in the chapter, is alternative compensation systems. So I mentioned Buffer, I mentioned GitLab, where they have very public and fixed systems of pay, where this many years of experience and stuff equals this pay. So it's cool in that you can, before you go interview with the company, you will know exactly how much they'll pay you, which is kind of interesting. There's other things going on with public pay or even globally fixed per role salaries. It doesn't matter where you live, you get paid the same for the same job. A lot of these are there to reduce bias, at least that's the intent, is to reduce bias in the salary process. And for that, I very much appreciate them. I don't have any direct experience with them, which is why I don't talk about them, because it would be me opining without any real knowledge. I do think these are all interesting. I will say, if I was going to start a new company today, would I embrace one of these? I might actually do that. Partially because I think it's much easier to go from having one of these compensation systems to a different one than it is to start with a much more, dare I say, traditional system and then adapt this one. Because in that world, some people are going to make more and they're going to be happy, and a lot of people are going to make less and they're going to be unhappy. And to me, that has been a trade-off I just haven't been willing to make. And while I do feel very strongly about trying to reduce bias in compensation, and I talk a lot about that in the chapter, it's a lot to ask of people to adopt this when that wasn't their choice. One of the cool things about Buffer and GitLab now, I don't know if GitLab started this way or not, is that if you're choosing to go there, you're choosing to be paid in this way. You're making a conscious choice. And it might even be you're going to this company because you're interested in that. And I think that's cool. I think that's awesome. I just haven't been in a position to try it. At some point, I'm hoping to learn a lot more about that. And maybe I'll write something new at that point. But I did want to touch on it both in the book to acknowledge it exists, because really what I'm talking about with salary here is a very traditional way of doing salary. Whenever I've been a manager, and this is going back again into the 90s, this is how salaries worked, is the way I describe in this chapter. It is still the way it works at the vast majority of companies, which is why I talk about this. But I'm hoping to see these take off or gain more traction, because I do think they're interesting, and I don't think that the way we do salary today is the best way to do it. just with so much stuff attached to it, I've been reticent. Really, there's a lot of things I want to push for change in the workplace. This one's particularly a difficult one, and I just haven't been in a place where I'm like, this is the thing we need to fix right now, but maybe someday. We'll see. In any case, I hope you enjoy and learn from this chapter. This is part 3 of writing performance reviews. This is making salary recommendations. Writing useful performance reviews, making a raise recommendation. Originally published on December 18th, 2021. Determining compensation is a crucial part of performance management. I fully believe in the autonomy, mastery, and purpose trio for motivation as outlined in Daniel Pink's book Drive. However, experience has shown me that even people who have all 3 of the trio still expect performance in their role to result in more significant compensation. Aside from hiring or firing an employee, compensation decisions are the most important decisions a manager can make. The decision is significant because the basis for next year's compensation is this year's, especially if you stay at the same company. A manager's mistake in remuneration can result in significant difference in lifetime salary for someone. Aside from hiring or firing an employee, compensation decisions are the most important decisions a manager can make. The decision is significant because the basis for next year's compensation is this year's, especially if you stay at the same company. A manager's mistake in remuneration can result in significant difference in lifetime salary for someone. Therefore, the compensation change recommendation must be highly considered and fair. In some companies, the manager creating and delivering the performance review has little input in the compensation decision. If this is your situation, it is still helpful to understand how salary works at other companies, since you may hire people from those places. It is also beneficial when you are responsible for that decision after a promotion. How does the compensation process work? Many junior managers have unrealistic expectations around what can be done with compensation because they don't understand that it is part of the greater corporate budgeting process. As a result, they imagine an infinite pool of money to draw from for raises. Every company does its budget and compensation processes differently, but there are common aspects across all the companies I've worked at. One generally true statement is that larger companies will typically be more fixed in their processes and make exceptions infrequently. The compensation budget is part of the larger company budget, which is agreed upon with the board of directors before the start of the year. An essential measure of the ability of the senior leadership team is their capability of working within the constraints of this agreed-upon budget. This budget objective means that at the most senior levels of the company, someone is keeping an eye on the total salary budget for your organization and will work very hard to make sure that it is not over budget. There's a target salary budget for your team based on the team's current salaries and the board's agreed-upon raise budget as a delta. Your manager will recoup the difference from another team if they allow you to go beyond that budget. Does this mean you shouldn't go over budget if it is warranted? No, but it means you have to have realistic expectations about what is possible. To avoid budget constraint challenges, line managers in some organizations do not have salary recommendation responsibility. If you can make salary recommendations for your team, how does the procedure generally work? You receive your team's current salaries and some indication of what their most recent raises were, an idea of the overall budget target for the organization, usually presented as a percentage delta on existing salaries, the salary bands that individuals are currently in, and some guidance around the process, possibly including some default raise percentages for different levels of performance. If you don't receive all this information, you should request it. It is vital for the decision-making process. You make an additional recommendation for each team member, which you send to your boss. Your manager combines your proposals with those of your peers, adds in their own direct reports, including you, massages the number somewhat and passes it to their boss, who does the same. This process continues to the CEO. A few weeks or months later, You receive the final salary numbers for all your reports to communicate to them, either as part of the performance review or separately. Sometimes the numbers are identical to those you recommended, sometimes they are different. Sometimes your boss knows why the numbers are different, and sometimes they do not. Equity, stock, bonuses, and salary serve different purposes as part of a compensation plan. Salary is just one part of a compensation scheme. Stock, bonuses, if your company has them, commissions, usually only for the sales team, and benefits are all part of how a company attracts and retains its employees. Each of these elements has a different purpose. Salary is a direct measure of employee performance. It is to reward someone for doing a good job. Employees who are high performers are paid more than others in the role whose work isn't as valuable. Equity, in the form of stock grants or options, is usually seen as a measure of employee potential. Since these vest over time, they are an incentive for an employee to stay longer. Therefore, you want employees who have high potential to stay and grow at the company. Some companies also use equity to offset salaries, since the immediate cost to the company is less. Benefits are often overlooked because they are given equally to all employees, but they can be vital to employee retention. For example, if an employee is interested in developing their skills, letting them know that the company can pay for additional training is a significant statement and may counterbalance a raise that they are not happy with. When making recommendations around employee compensation, take all the aspects of your company's compensation plan into account. Different elements will be more important at various times to your employees. What about fixed compensation systems? Some companies, notably Buffer and GitLab, have adopted fixed formula models for employee compensation and transparency around those models. Company founders designed these models to be fair and reduce bias. I think there's a lot of potential in these models, and the people I know at companies that have them are fans. Typically, the companies that do fixed compensation systems adopt them very early instead of switching to them later. The companies are transparent around their compensation, which is critical with a non-standard model. As such, people generally self-select into those companies. The mechanics of switching to that model seem very difficult to me. It is worth paying attention to companies using these systems to see how they scale and grow and to see if they become the norm. What is the right raise for someone? The significant part of the fixed compensation systems is that they take the bias and subjectivity out of the raise decision. The bias is all built into the decisions that created the original model. You should strive to be objective and fair for the more standard processes. You should validate the reasoning you are using with your manager and peers to ensure that the organization uses a consistent rationale. Start with their current salary. Where is the person's current salary within the salary band? Does that current salary make sense given their past performance? Has the band gone up significantly since the last salary review period? Where do they sit relative to their peers in their same role and level doing similar quality work? Now think about their performance since the last salary review. Are they meeting your expectations or exceeding them? Not achieving them? What has been their trajectory over the last few periods? Are they gaining momentum? Losing it? Is the person being promoted? If you are promoting the person, you should be gauging them against the bands for their new level. Unless a promotion is long overdue or the person was very highly paid relative to their peers in their previous level, they should be coming into the lower part of their new salary bands. Placing them in the appropriate spot in the salary band gives them ample room for raises as they grow into their new responsibilities. Now look at the target percentage for the organization. Some of your team should be over that, and some should be under. Your boss will tell you if they expect you to achieve a budget target or not. Even if you anticipate not to come in exactly on budget, you shouldn't be wildly off it. Now, based on the target budget, the person's current salary and their performance, put in your initial number for them. If you aren't given a spreadsheet with your team's numbers, you should create one. I generally have a spreadsheet and create it if I don't get one from the HR team. The spreadsheet would have their name, the person's level, their salary bands, their current salary, their last raise, the proposed increase, and the new salary. So those total up and then are compared against the budget I have. A spreadsheet helps you look at your recommendations for people relative to one another, and it enables you to understand what you regard as the target for your team. As you figure out your initial recommendation for each person, enter it into the spreadsheet. Don't pay attention to any of the other data while you do it. If it helps, you can hide any rows or columns that you are concerned may throw off your judgment. You can also enter it into another tab if you prefer. After you've done your first pass numbers for everyone on your team, you can see where you are relative to your budget. You should also look across the team to ensure you're using consistent logic. It is better to look at percentages rather than salary amounts at this stage. Are the overperforming people relative to your career rubric getting more significant raises than those underperforming or merely meeting expectations? Are the raises going to underperformers in alignment with their performance? One way to approach this is to think about the raise conversation relative to the performance conversation. Are you saying the same thing with both? For example, a sizable raise completely blunts a stern message to someone underperforming. Similarly, a slight raise blunts any positive message in the performance review for an overperformer. If the raise percentages seem fair, look at the budget total. Are you over budget? If you are over budget by a relatively small amount and your manager has not asked you to be right on target, you may be ready to show them the numbers for their input. On the other hand, if your manager has asked you to be right on budget, then you will need to make some adjustments. There are several things you can try to reduce the overall amount. If you are significantly over budget, you can use one or more of several techniques for bringing your numbers down. You may reduce all the raise recommendations by a fixed percentage amount. Applying the same amount of reduction to all your recommendations keeps them at the same relative to one another. Instead of giving small percentage raises to underperformers, consider reducing them to 0. If someone is significantly underperforming, recommend no raise rather than giving them an insubstantial raise. Receiving no raise will ensure a difficult review conversation, but it will reinforce the underperformance message. Decrease individuals' percentages to achieve a rounded salary number. When given their new salary information, people will look at the percentage and the new salary number and remember one of them, the salary. They won't recollect the exact wage. They will round the number in their heads. Take advantage of that to get some extra headroom. Let's look at a fictional employee, Sandy. Sandy has done very well this year, and you want to reward them with a big raise. Your first idea is a 9% raise, which will give them a new salary of $70,850. After doing the rest of the raises, you are more over budget than your manager is okay with. Since Sandy is your second highest paid employee and is getting a big raise, you can give them a slightly smaller amount and they will likely not miss it. Instead, if you gave them an 8.46% raise, that would give them a new salary of $70,500, a nice round number, and it would save you $350. If you needed more room, $70,250 or even $70,000 are still big raises from their initial $65,000, but are only minor percentage differences from your initial idea. Robin hooding helps you give more significant raises to lower paid employees. The rounding trick I mentioned above is also helpful if you work against budget constraints, but you want to give more significant raises to those on the lower end of the salary spectrum. A small percentage change for a well-paid person can be a very substantial percentage change for someone who is less paid. I call shifting small percentages from higher paid to lower paid employees Robin hooding. If you are under budget, should you increase your raises? The answer to this question will depend on your organizational culture and norms. If this is your first time making salary recommendations, you might ask your manager for guidance. If all your peers come in over budget and you are under, you may either look fiscally responsible, overly critical, or like an obvious place to find more funding for your peers' excesses. You don't want your team to suffer for other managers' inability to meet a budget. If you are significantly under budget, you may want to re-examine your recommendations, as this would indicate a seriously underperforming team. Once you are happy with your overall recommendations from an individual and budget perspective, take one last look at them before submitting them to your manager. Are your recommendations saying something you do not intend? For example, is there one group getting the majority of the large or small raises? Look for your own unconscious biases appearing in the numbers. Once you are fully satisfied that your recommendations indicate the performance of the individuals on your team, submit them to your HR representative or manager for the next phase of the process. What happens next? Your manager may want to review your recommendations with you or with you and your peers together. Your manager must ensure that each report uses consistent guidelines for their recommendations. They may do this independently or may pull all their manager reports together for a more extensive session. At a prior company, we called this the Battle Royale. Come prepared when it is time to review your recommendations with your manager or peers. Preparation should not be problematic if you have followed the recommendations from the previous chapters. The more concrete examples you can provide to justify your proposals, the better. Your manager will incorporate the input from you and your peers into a larger version of your spreadsheet. They may need to modify some of your numbers to make their numbers work. Your manager will then do a similar review with their peers, and it will go up the levels of the organization, potentially to the senior leadership team. The more information you give your manager, the easier it will be for them to preserve and defend your recommendations. The information you provide them will also give their manager more information. Once there is agreement on the salary changes for the organization, the finance team updates the numbers in the payroll system. You then receive the final numbers to pass on to your employees. I discuss the salary and performance review conversations in the next chapter. So that was chapter 21 of It Depends. Most of the way through the book now. Very exciting. Hopefully that chapter gave you some things to think about, especially when it comes time to do performance reviews next, your next performance review cycle. Again, I want to point you to itdependsbook.net, where you can get information about the book, links to the stores, links to the podcast, links to the newsletter, and also information on how to contact me. If you do want to contact me for questions or comments or anything, the email address is contact@itdependsbook.net. Hope you have a great week. I'll see you next week in the newsletter and 2 weeks from now back on this podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Please, again, subscribe, rate, share episodes of this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you for Answers to April for the music used in this podcast. To hear more from Answers to April, visit answerstoapril.com. This podcast is a production of Unit Circle Media.